On November 5, 1956, British and French paratroopers dropped into battle over Egypt, while amphibious forces stormed in from the sea. They were there to take back the Suez Canal, which had been nationalized by Colonel Nasser, Egypt's president, 3 months earlier. But within 7 weeks, the British and French were pulling out, humiliated by the crushing weight of world opinion. The invasion of Egypt had been a catastrophic blunder. The British public was deeply divided, and mass protests nearly turned into riots. It also marked the end of the career of Anthony Eden, Britain's Prime Minister. He resigned a sick and broken man. Eden had failed to recognize that the world order had changed. Britain could no longer act as if it still ruled an overseas empire. On the other hand, Egypt's Nasser became a hero to his own people and the entire Arab world. As Egypt celebrated, Britain and France were totally discredited. As a result, both countries lost their influence in the Middle East to the United States and the Soviet Union. Since 2000 BC, people had dreamed about a waterway linking the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. But it was not until 1854 that Ferdinand de Lesseps, a French diplomat and engineer, realized how it could be done. De Lesseps used 1.5 million Egyptians to dig a canal. 125,000 died in the process. With the British and French governments as majority shareholders, the 103-mile-long Suez Canal opened in 1869. Both countries were determined it should never fall into the hands of a potential enemy. The British were particularly concerned. The canal was a lifeline to India, their greatest colonial possession. So in 1882, Britain took over Egypt. When World War I broke out in 1914, the British declared Egypt its protectorate. It was now important to keep the canal open, to transport troops and equipment to the Middle East. To protect the canal, the British fought against the Turks in Palestine. In 1936, a 16-year-old named Farouk was crowned King of Egypt. By then, Britain had granted Egypt limited independence. Shortly after his coronation, Farouk signed a pact with Britain. It allowed Egypt to conduct its own foreign policy. But to the annoyance of Egyptian nationalists, the British maintained control of the Suez. During World War II, Britain and her allies battled Germany and Italy in the deserts of North Africa. Egypt was ostensibly neutral at the time, even though it was occupied by large numbers of British and Allied troops. The Suez Canal remained a vital passage for supplies to the Middle East. It also allowed the Royal Navy to move quickly between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. At the end of the war in 1945, Britain was determined to maintain its influence in the Mediterranean and Middle East. This meant holding the Suez Canal and the surrounding region. When the Cold War eventually began, the strategic importance of the Suez Canal zone was reinforced in the eyes of the British, and by 1951, more than 70% of the West's oil was being transported through the canal. It was not long before the Canal Zone became the largest military base in the world, equipped with barracks, airfields, and other facilities. Egyptian nationalists bitterly resented the British presence and committed acts of terrorism. Nationalists also despised Farouk, Egypt's dissolute playboy monarch. On July 23, 1952, the unpopular Farouk was deposed by a group of Egyptian army officers. They were unhappy with his excesses and wanted Egypt to become its own republic. The coup was led by General Mohammed Naguib. His trusted colleague was the charismatic Colonel Gamal Nasser. Within 2 years, Nasser took over from Naguib. He was determined to unite the Arab world against Israel, which defeated Egypt in the Arab-Israeli War of 1948-1949. Nasser was also violently opposed to Britain. He considered Britain the prime mover behind the Baghdad Pact, an anti-Soviet alliance that included Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan. Nasser perceived this as a political threat to Egypt. Soon after coming to power, Nasser began lobbying for funds from around the world to build the Aswan Dam on the Nile. The West agreed to consider the proposal. But Nasser also moved closer to the Soviet Union, which wanted to gain influence in the region. The U.S. became alarmed when Nasser accepted $320 million worth of arms from the Russians. John Foster Dulles, then the U.S. Secretary of State, announced there would be no aid from the West for Nasser's Aswan development program. Meanwhile, Nasser continued to negotiate with Britain over its future role in Egypt. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden agreed to withdraw troops by June 1956, but this did not include abandoning the Suez Canal. Nasser was furious over being denied Western funds for the Aswan Dam. On July 26, 1956, he seized control of the Suez Canal on behalf of Egypt. The world held its breath and waited to see how the Western powers would react. The British and French were stunned by Egyptian leader Colonel Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. He could now cut off their vital oil supplies. Their first reaction, along with the United States, was to freeze Egypt's assets. No one believed that Egypt could run the canal alone. The United States, however, was opposed to the use of force. It proposed that an international organization take over the canal. Nasser flatly rejected the suggestion. It was left to the United Nations to come up with a solution. But a flurry of diplomatic activity failed to resolve the crisis. Britain and France began planning a military campaign to recover the canal. First, they considered using British troops based in neighboring Libya. But King Idris of Libya refused to cooperate. So, a direct invasion of the canal zone was planned, which would use airborne troops from Cyprus and amphibious forces from Algeria and Malta. Unfortunately for Britain, many of its best troops were bogged down in Cyprus and Malaya, fighting counterinsurgency campaigns. The United States vetoed the use of any British troops involved with NATO. This left only those troops based in the UK, many of whom were not fully trained. The British government had to rely on reservists. All this took time. Meanwhile, opposition grew at home. Aneurin Bevan, a fiery Welsh Labour Party politician, launched an attack on Eden.
Anthony Eden has been pretending that he is now invading Egypt in order to strengthen the United Nations. Every burglar, of course, could say the same thing. He could argue that he was entering the house in order to train the police. So if Sir Anthony Eden is sincere in what he is saying, and he may be, then if he is sincere in what he is saying, then he is too stupid to be a prime minister.
Undaunted, Britain's military planning, as well as diplomatic efforts to reach a settlement, continued. But now, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's prime minister, told Britain and France that his country was preparing to invade Egypt. Israel had long felt threatened by Egypt. Nasser had closed off the Israeli port of Eilat at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, a narrow Red Sea inlet bordered by Sinai on the west and Jordan to the east. The Suez Crisis gave Israel and its military the perfect opportunity for a preemptive strike on Egypt, and it would be supported by two of the most powerful Western nations. It was decided that Israel would invade Egypt first and take one side of the canal. Britain and France, whose troops were already on the move by sea and air, would make one last attempt at diplomacy. If they failed, they would send their own troops to occupy the canal zone. But the United States was opposed to armed intervention in Egypt. U.S. leaders, including President Eisenhower, were increasingly concerned about Britain's outdated imperialist attitude. Toward the end of October 1956, the tension over Suez escalated. The Soviet Union took advantage of the crisis and an impending presidential election in the United States. It crushed a popular uprising in Hungary, one of its satellite states. A few days later, Israeli paratroopers and ground forces struck Egypt. The crisis over the Suez had now escalated into armed conflict. The invasion of Egypt began on October 29, 1956, when Israeli paratroopers dropped from the sky. Ground forces invaded the Sinai. Once they had established themselves at the vital Mitla Pass, the paratroopers joined with the ground forces. The ground forces originated from Kantilla, just over the border with Israel. Meanwhile, Israeli forces in the north of Sinai outflanked the dazed and unprepared Egyptians. They smashed through Egyptian defenses at the Suez Canal and swept up masses of bewildered prisoners. The Egyptian public was outraged and called for revenge. Nasser was taken completely by surprise. He had no idea Israel would enter the dispute. On October 30th, 1956, Britain and France followed their prearranged plan. They demanded that all fighting cease within 12 hours and both sides withdraw 10 miles from the canal. If these conditions were not met, Britain and France would intervene and enforce a ceasefire. This had been ordered by the United Nations after Israel invaded Egypt. Not surprisingly, the ultimatum was ignored. That night, a British amphibious force left Malta for Egypt. The French were on their way from Algeria. Simultaneously, British Royal Air Force bombers took off from Cyprus and began attacking Egyptian air bases. This was a prelude to ground troops securing the canal. On November 5th, British and French airborne troops dropped at Port Said and Port Fouad at the entrance of the canal. The next day, ground troops landed and began to advance south down the line of the canal. They were backed by a series of carrier-based air attacks. Reinforcements poured in ever-increasing numbers. The plan was to seize the entire west bank of the Suez Canal. Although the Egyptians were numbed by this new assault, Nasser refused to surrender. The preliminary naval bombardment, combined with street fighting, resulted in a great deal of damage. There were many civilian casualties among the Egyptians. The world was appalled. In a dramatic attempt to thwart the invasion, Nasser blocked the canal. More than 30 merchant ships were sunk in the shallow water. Safe passage became virtually impossible. The United Nations demanded an immediate ceasefire, endorsed by the United States. The British and French knew they had to accept President Eisenhower's condemnation.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. As it is the manifest right of any of these nations to take such decisions and actions, it is likewise our right, if our judgment so dictates, to dissent. We believe these actions to have been taken in error, for we do not accept the use of force as a wise or proper instrument for the settlement of international disputes.
The Soviet Union and its leader Nikita Khrushchev joined the United States in opposing the invasion. Both countries felt it threatened their own interests in the Middle East. Britain accepted the terms of the ceasefire. On November 6th, the United Nations troops moved in. The French also complied with the ceasefire. Neither the Israelis nor the Egyptians dissented. The UN force was met by mixed feelings by the local people. They were delighted to oust the British and French, but did not relish still more foreign troops on their soil. As the UN took control in Egypt, Britain and France became increasingly isolated. On December 22, 1956, under the watchful eye of UN commanders, they withdrew from Suez. A triumphant Nasser was left in firm control of the Suez Canal. He had never been more popular at home or in the Arab world at large. Militarily and politically, the Suez Crisis was a complete disaster, particularly for the British. The British government had misunderstood public opinion, both at home and around the world. The events at the Suez Canal confirmed that Britain's days as an empire were ending. Prime Minister Anthony Eden was humiliated by the affair. He resigned in January 1957, sick and exhausted. Eden's greatest blunder was his inability to understand that the world had moved past British imperialism. Britain could no longer act as though it ruled the world. In contrast, Nasser's reputation had been enhanced. He remained Egypt's head of state until he died in 1970. To the chagrin of Britain and France, Egypt went on to prove that it was quite capable of managing the canal efficiently. Thanks to their bungled invasion of Egypt, Britain and France lost their standing in the Middle East. There was little they could do but watch as the United States and the Soviet Union usurped their influence in the region.